Hello, this is not John T. Rhapsodies, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Mr. Rhapsodies has asked me to read his original stories, all written in an old-school style. If you like this story, please consider clicking the thumbs up and subscribe icons. This will help the channel grow, and it will help you to stay notified of new stories. And so, let us together hear the words of old. Remembering Tomorrow by John T. Rhapsodies, Esquire. In the spring of 1921, Little Rock was a town where history dripped from the walls like humidity, and whose streets, like streets in all towns in the wide world, knew secrets that still walked around, not quite buried. What was then called the Great War, and the war to end all wars, and what we now know as the First World War, had officially ended in 1918, just shy of 3 years before our setting, or at least the setting we'll begin with, since times and places are not always static, at least for some people, as we will see. Verily, the Great War had ended officially for the over 70,000 men that Arkansas sent to the trenches and the no-man's lands between them. But the ghastly war's haunting breath still hung heavy in the lungs of many of Little Rock's sons, and in the silence of those who had returned in flag-draped boxes. One day, near the Choctaw Route, or the Choctaw, Oklahoma and Gulf Railroad, a young man limped off the train wearing a faded army greatcoat and army boots, with one of them missing its heel. His face bore an expression that was both young and old, as if both were ill-fitting masks vying for supremacy. If you were to look at him too long, you might say his eyes were the wrong kind of blue, too deep and too wise for such a young man. When asked, the man referred to himself as Jonas Mac-Intyre, though one got the feeling it was not his real name, but rather a borrowed one. Jonas professed veteran status, recently discharged. Upon request, he would offer as proof a crumpled yellow telegram from the War Department and a circular silver-hued dog tag bearing his unit and his name, although the latter was worn illegible. The townsfolk accepted Jonas readily. Their hearts had been softened and haunted by the experiences of their own war-torn sons. He found work as a clock repairman, though he was not very good at such repairs and seemed to prefer them broken. Mrs. Maxwell, wife of the funeral director who lived behind the Presbyterian church, was the first to notice something peculiar about Jonas Mac-Intyre. One Thursday afternoon, he had stopped by her house to repair her grandfather clock, inherited from her late uncle. She said he worked somewhat slowly, but was pleasant in conversation, and reminded her of her late brother who passed away almost too many years ago to remember. It wasn't those interactions that troubled her, but rather what he said just after he had finished and as he was leaving. "You should put out some buckets of water on your porch, Mrs. Maxwell. There will be a fire tomorrow. It will start near the back of the church." The very next morning at dawn, the fire broke out just where he said it would. No one was hurt, but the church lost its workshed and gained a rumor. Mrs. Maxwell told the fire marshal what Jonas had said. When they asked him where he had been that morning, he said he was at the clock repair shop, which the owner confirmed. When asked how he knew about the fire, Jonas merely shrugged and said, "I dreamed it." He paused and took off his hat and scratched his head. Then he added, "Sometimes I see things too early." This would not be the last prediction that came true. When a boy went missing during a powerful thunderstorm, he told the sheriff he could be found by the riverbank, and so he was. He warned Mr. James Pascal not to go driving into the Ozarks. The next day, a rockslide closed the road for several days. He told Miss Jean Marie Wilson that her fiancé would never return from that Memphis trip because he would change his mind about the marriage and marry the wrong girl. And so he did. But to dispel what you may be thinking, Jonas was not responsible for these events. He just knew about them because he saw them. The people of Little Rock grew both fond and fearful of Jonas Mac-Intyre. Some of them sought answers. Others turned and walked the opposite direction when they saw him limping near with his heelless boot. Preachers warned of the Bible's prohibition against soothsaying and seeking such things. Children dared each other to run up and touch his coat and then ask him to tell them their future. But Jonas seemed neither angry nor amused. After a time, he only gave predictions when asked, and sometimes not even then. When asked where he obtained such an ability, he would just say, "It's a gift," or a curse. "It all depends on if I'm standing in the right time." His deep blue eyes would grow distant, as though he had stepped 1 foot into the future that very moment, yet still here, a man of two worlds. On a crisp afternoon, Jonas Mac-Intyre collapsed in what was then called City Park, and what would later be renamed MacArthur Park in 1942, almost in the middle of the Second World War that was never supposed to have happened. He had been staring at the City Park sign, and then simply froze in mid-step just before falling like a thought, lost mid-sentence. After being carried to St. Vincent Infirmary, the physician pronounced him alive, but trapped in some kind of waking fugue. Jonas mumbled while his deep blue eyes flickered and his muscles twitched as if he was caught between moments. They say he spoke of cities and even countries not yet built, rulers not yet born, and machines that flew without wings or discernible motors. For a brief but harrowing moment, he grabbed a nurse's starched sleeve and said, "I saw this town burning. Not from fire, but from some kind of light that melted men." Jonas died that night, or so it was thought. They took him to the funeral home where Mrs. Maxwell, the funeral director's wife, placed a single rose upon his chest before they closed the casket. She had grown fond of him and thought he looked peaceful, as if he were merely dreaming his way into another century. She thought of her brother, who had passed so many years ago, and she wept for him, and Jonas too. When those who knew him, and those who merely knew of him, came to the funeral the next morning, they learned that the coffin was inexplicably empty. Upon investigation, there was no sign of forced entry or exit at the funeral parlor. The doors were locked and the windows latched. There was, however, a peculiar trail of mud leading from the casket to the back room, where they had placed Jonah's old clothes, including his boots with the one missing heel, all of which remained in the back room, undisturbed. Rumors of Jonas Mac-Intyre's disappearance grew like Spanish moss on stately oaks, drifting, half true, and tangled in every downtown conversation from Gaines Street to the banks of the Arkansas River. Mrs. Maxwell swore she heard his voice while swinging in her porch swing during the full moon a couple of days later. She said a dark figure limped down the sidewalk, raving something about 1929 and some kind of crash. After that night, just like no one could say why Jonas ever came to Little Rock that day on the train in the first place, no one could say what happened to him before or after 1921. Postscript. On a late afternoon in 1947, in a government office somewhere near the Potomac River on the Virginia side, an office clerk named Rutherford Wainwright was organizing military files. He stopped for a moment to read a folder marked Mac-Intyre, Jonas T. Inside the folder were various photographs. One was dated 1898, featuring a young man not a day over 20 in a uniform during the Spanish-American War. Another photo showed the same man in a greatcoat standing in a trench, dated 1917. A third photo unmistakably showed the same young face, standing behind General Douglas MacArthur in Japan in 1945. On the back of the third photo was the following handwritten note. Soldier believed to possess premonitory knowledge and the ability to time shift. Documented appearances in 1898, 1917, 1921, 1929, 1945. More suspected. No record of death or birth. Likely connected to Project Chronos, since closed and defunded. Disavowed. If located, do not detain or otherwise interact. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please click the thumbs up icon and subscribe to the channel. Please also consider telling your friends that they too should hear the words of old.